The crystal chandeliers cast a brittle, almost cold light across the opulent dining room, reflecting off the polished mahogany table and the expensive silverware. The air hummed with low conversation, the clinking of glasses, and the hushed whispers of waiters attending to the city's elite. Li Zhen sat stiffly, her silk dress rustling against the plush chair, a stark contrast to the turmoil brewing within her. She watched Yu Sheng, his back to her as he laughed, his voice a shade too loud, his hand resting a little too long on the shoulder of the woman beside him. A familiar knot tightened in her stomach. This was the third business dinner this week, each one stretching later into the night, each one punctuated by a different woman draped on his arm. He hadn't even noticed her arrival. How could he, when his attention was so thoroughly captivated elsewhere? Her fingers tightened around the stem of her wine glass. This contract with the Red Sea Group was crucial for the Li family, and Yu Sheng's presence, his good mood, was essential. Her father, Li Yinan, had made that abundantly clear. The weight of his expectations pressed down on her, a heavy cloak of familial duty. The woman beside Yu Sheng tilted her head back, her laughter echoing through the room. It grated on Li Zhen's nerves, a sharp, discordant note in the otherwise harmonious symphony of the evening. Li Zhen knew this dance. She knew the subtle shifts in his body language, the calculated charm he employed, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he was feigning genuine amusement. She'd been the recipient of that charm once, a lifetime ago, when their marriage had still held the promise of happiness. Now, it was a performance, a hollow echo of what they once had. She took a slow, deliberate sip of wine, the tartness a welcome distraction from the bitter taste rising in her throat. With a forced smile, Li Zhen rose from her seat and approached Yu Sheng's table. Her heels clicked against the marble floor, each step a measured beat against the rising tide of anger. As she reached their table, Yu Sheng finally turned, his expression shifting from jovial amusement to mild surprise. The woman beside him, startled, straightened her posture. Yu Sheng, Li Zhen began, her voice carefully modulated, "Father is waiting. The contract is ready to be signed." He frowned, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. "Can't it wait, Li Zhen? I'm in the middle of a conversation." "No," she said, her voice hardening, the carefully constructed facade of composure beginning to crack. "It cannot wait. This is important, you know that." Inside, a cold, hard knot of resentment formed. Did he truly not understand, or did he simply not care? "Fine," he sighed, rising to his feet with an air of exaggerated patience. He offered a cursory apology to the woman beside him, his eyes lingering a beat too long. Li Zhen suppressed a shudder of disgust. "Go home by 11 o'clock tonight," Li Zhen said, her voice low, barely audible above the surrounding chatter. It was a command disguised as a request, a last-ditch effort to salvage what little remained of their marriage. Yu Sheng paused, his eyes narrowing. "And if I don't?" he challenged, his voice laced with a dangerous undercurrent. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken accusations. Li Zhen's heart hammered against her ribs. "If you don't come home with me today," she said, each word a deliberate strike against the fragile wall of their relationship, "so let's get a divorce." The silence that followed was deafening. The air crackled with tension. Yu Sheng's face paled, then flushed with anger. The casual mask he usually wore slipped, revealing the raw, wounded pride beneath. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again, his jaw tight. The woman beside him watched the exchange with wide, curious eyes. Finally, Yu Sheng let out a short, harsh laugh. "Okay," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You're getting a divorce, right? Then leave." He gestured dismissively toward the door, his eyes blazing with a cold fury that sent a shiver down Li Zhen's spine. Li Zhen's breath hitched. A strange calm descended over her, a chilling acceptance of the inevitable. For a moment, she simply stared at him, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Regret, anger, relief, and a strange, lingering sadness warred within her. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away, her heels clicking against the marble floor, each step echoing the finality of her decision. The opulent restaurant, the glittering chandeliers, the hushed conversations, they all faded into the background, leaving only the hollow ache in her chest and the chilling realization that her life had just irrevocably changed. The contract, the family, her father's expectations, none of it mattered now. She had crossed a line, burned a bridge, and there was no going back. As she stepped out into the cool night air, a single thought echoed in her mind: what now? The remnants of the day clung to the edges of the skyscrapers, a hazy orange bleed against the encroaching twilight. Yuxing sat rigidly behind his vast mahogany desk, the surface gleaming under the strategically placed downlights. The opulent office, usually a symbol of his success, felt like a cage tonight. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass, the ice clinking softly, a counterpoint to the roaring silence in his head. He could still see Li Zhen's face, the faint tremor in her voice as she'd uttered the words that had shattered the carefully constructed facade of their marriage. Divorce. The word echoed in the hollow spaces of his heart, a bitter taste on his tongue. He hadn't expected it, not truly. He'd always believed he held the reins, that Li Zhen, despite her occasional defiance, would never truly break free. His pride, a carefully cultivated shield, had been pierced. He took a long swallow of the whiskey, the burn a fleeting distraction. Xiaoyu, his assistant, stood nervously by the door, shuffling a stack of papers. Yuxing's usual controlled demeanor had frayed, replaced by a volatile tension that radiated from him like heat. He dismissed her with a curt wave, the silence returning, thick and suffocating. He poured another drink, the clink of ice a brittle sound in the stillness. He hadn't anticipated this visceral, gut-wrenching anger. He'd convinced himself it was a strategic move on Li Zhen's part, a play for power, a desperate attempt to renegotiate their unspoken contract. But the look in her eyes, he pushed the thought away, unwilling to dissect it, to confront the unsettling flicker of vulnerability he'd glimpsed beneath her carefully constructed mask. A knock interrupted his brooding. Boss Wang, one of his oldest business associates, entered, his face etched with concern. Yuxing, I heard. I'm so sorry. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken questions. Yuxing managed a tight smile, a pale imitation of his usual charm. It's nothing. A minor disagreement. He knew the news would spread like wildfire through their circles, each whisper a tiny barb tearing at his carefully constructed image. He'd built his empire on the foundation of control, of meticulous planning. This felt like a catastrophic system failure. Boss Wang poured himself a drink, his movements slow and deliberate. He studied Yuxing, his gaze sharp and perceptive. These things happen, he said finally, his voice low and laced with a knowing weariness. Sometimes, it's better to let go. Yuxing scoffed, the sound sharp and brittle. Let go. He'd built his life around Li Zhen, around the image of their perfect union. He'd molded her, shaped her, convinced himself he was doing it for her own good. He clenched his jaw, the muscle throbbing. Let go, he repeated, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. She'll come crawling back. The conviction in his voice sounded hollow even to his own ears. Boss Wang sighed, a sound laden with years of accumulated wisdom. Perhaps. Or perhaps not. Sometimes, distance offers clarity. He paused, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. It would be nice to be apart for a while. It just so happens that I am busy at this time. Let her be deserted and reflect. His words, seemingly casual, held a subtle undercurrent of advice, a hint of warning. Yuxing nodded, a flicker of something akin to understanding crossing his face. He knew Wang was right. Absence, he hoped, would make the heart grow fonder. It would give Li Zhen time to realize the magnitude of her mistake, the precariousness of her position without his protection. The night deepened, the city lights twinkling like scattered diamonds against the velvet sky. Yu Sheng and Boss Wang continued to talk, the conversation shifting to business, to the intricate dance of power and influence that governed their world. But beneath the surface, Yu Sheng's thoughts remained tethered to Li Zhen, to the unraveling threads of their life together. He imagined her alone in their apartment, the silence amplifying her isolation. He pictured her reaching for the phone, the unspoken plea in her eyes as she dialed his number. He saw her regret, her remorse, her desperate yearning for the security he provided. He allowed himself to savor the imagined victory, the sweet taste of her surrender. He wouldn't make it easy for her. He'd let her stew in her own uncertainty, let her feel the full weight of her impulsive decision. He'd give her space, as Boss Wang suggested. He'd withdraw, become a phantom in her life, a constant, unsettling presence just beyond her reach. He'd let the silence speak volumes, let the absence erode her resolve. He'd wait, patiently, like a spider spinning its web, until she was caught in the intricate silken threads of his design. He knew Li Zhen. He knew her strengths, her weaknesses, the hidden vulnerabilities she tried so desperately to conceal. He knew how to break her, how to bend her to his will. He'd done it before, and he wouldn't hesitate to do it again. The whiskey warmed his throat, a deceptive comfort against the cold knot of unease that tightened in his chest. He pushed the feeling away, refusing to acknowledge the sliver of doubt that whispered in the back of his mind. He couldn't afford doubt. He couldn't afford to question the carefully constructed narrative he'd built around their relationship, around his own sense of self. He was Yu Sheng, the architect of his own destiny. He controlled the game, and Li Zhen, whether she realized it or not, was still a pawn in his intricate, carefully orchestrated game of power. The low hum of conversation, punctuated by the clinking of glasses, filled the dimly lit bar. The air hung thick with the scent of expensive whiskey and something vaguely floral, perhaps from the elaborate centerpiece on the mahogany table. Yu Sheng, a tight knot in his stomach, forced a smile as he raised his glass in a toast. To Mr. Zhang, our new vice president. May he lead us to even greater heights. His voice sounded hollow, even to his own ears. Another meaningless gathering, he thought, the word sour in his mind. Another charade of camaraderie. His gaze drifted over the faces of his colleagues, their expressions ranging from genuine enthusiasm to carefully constructed masks of professional courtesy. He wondered if anyone could see the turmoil churning beneath his own facade. He felt exposed, vulnerable, like a wound left carelessly uncovered. The arrival of Mr. Zhang had thrown the Red Sea group into a frenzy of speculation and jockeying for position. Yu Sheng found the whole affair tiresome. He'd been promised the VP position himself, a promise whispered in hushed tones, a promise that had evaporated like morning mist. His father, the chairman, had opted for fresh blood, a euphemism that stung like a slap. Fresh blood. Young blood. The words echoed the constant whispers about his inadequacy, the doubts about his ability to lead. He took a large gulp of his whiskey, the burn a welcome distraction. A sudden hush fell over the room, a ripple of whispers spreading like wildfire. Yu Sheng felt a prickle of unease, a premonition that tightened his chest. He turned, his gaze following the direction of everyone else's. Standing in the doorway, bathed in the soft glow of the entrance lights, was Li Zhen. She wore a simple black dress, the stark color a sharp contrast to her pale skin. Her hair, usually meticulously styled, fell loosely around her shoulders, framing a face that was both familiar and strangely distant. Her eyes, dark and luminous, met his across the room, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. He felt a jolt, a raw surge of emotion he couldn't quite name. Li Zhen moved into the room, her steps measured and deliberate, as if she were walking on a tightrope. She ignored the curious stares and the hushed whispers, her focus solely on Yusheng. Reaching the table, she stopped, her gaze unwavering. Yusheng, she said, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the silence like a shard of glass. I need to speak with you. He stared at her, his mind racing. What was she doing here? He'd barely seen her since the divorce. The word felt like a physical blow, a fresh wound reopening. He'd spent the last few days in a haze of anger and disbelief, trying to understand how their meticulously constructed life had crumbled so quickly. He swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry. Li Zhen, he managed, his voice barely a whisper. Why is she here? What does she want? He glanced at his colleagues, their faces a mixture of curiosity and thinly veiled amusement. The silence of the apartment pressed in on Li Zhen, a stark contrast to the opulent, yet often suffocating, atmosphere of the Yu family estate. Sunlight streamed through the sheer curtains, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, a silent ballet in the newly empty space. It had only been a few days, yet the quiet felt foreign, unsettling, like a melody missing its crucial notes. She ran a hand over the smooth, cool surface of the dining table, a simple, unadorned piece compared to the weighty mahogany of her former life. A faint, bittersweet smile touched her lips. It was hers. Every inch of this modestly furnished apartment was hers, a sanctuary built on the ruins of a life she no longer recognized. She found herself gravitating towards the small balcony, the city sprawling beneath her like a concrete jungle. Inhaling deeply, she savored the scent of exhaust fumes mingled with the distant aroma of street food, a strange comfort in its ordinariness. Up here, away from the stifling expectations and the weight of her family name, she felt a flicker of something akin to peace. It was a fragile peace, easily shattered by the memories that clawed at the edges of her mind. Memories of hushed arguments, forced smiles, and the suffocating weight of Yusheng's possessiveness. He'd always said he was protecting her, shielding her from the harsh realities of the world. But his protection felt more like a cage, gilded and ornate, but a cage nonetheless. Li Zhen wrapped her arms around herself, a shiver tracing its way down her spine despite the warmth of the sun. The divorce had been a whirlwind, a chaotic storm that had left her adrift, unsure of which direction to sail. Yet, amidst the wreckage, a strange sense of liberation had begun to bloom. It was a tentative bud, easily crushed, but undeniably present. She had spent so long living according to the script written by her father, by Yusheng, by society. Now, for the first time, she felt the possibility of writing her own narrative. The metallic tang of blood filled her mouth, a sudden and unwelcome reminder of the life growing within her. She placed a hand protectively on her stomach, a complex cocktail of emotions swirling within her. Fear, uncertainty, and a surprising surge of hope. It was Lu Yenming's child, a secret she carried like a precious, yet dangerous, jewel. She hadn't told him yet, the words catching in her throat each time she tried. The timing felt impossibly wrong, the situation impossibly complicated. Yet, the thought of him, his steady presence, the quiet strength in his eyes, brought a sense of calm amidst the storm. He had saved her life once, 7 years ago, a fact she had only recently discovered. Now, he was unknowingly saving her again, offering a lifeline in the turbulent waters of her life. The ringing of her phone shattered the silence. It was her father. She hesitated, her thumb hovering over the accept button. His voice, even through the phone, carried the weight of authority, the unspoken command to obey. A wave of resentment washed over her. He had orchestrated her marriage to Yusheng, a strategic alliance to solidify their family's position. And now, even in the midst of the wreckage, he was already plotting the next move, ensuring the continuation of the Li lineage. The contract, that damned contract, loomed over her like a dark cloud. A grandson. That was all he cared about. Li Zhen, his voice was clipped, devoid of any warmth. We need to discuss your situation. There's nothing to discuss, she replied, her voice surprisingly steady. The divorce is finalized. A heavy silence hung in the air, broken only by the faint hum of traffic from below. The contract still stands, Li Zhen. You understand the importance of fulfilling your obligations. Her grip tightened on the phone. Obligations? My only obligation now is to myself and my child. The words hung in the air, a declaration of independence, a rebellion against the life that had been chosen for her. You dare defy me? His voice was laced with a dangerous undercurrent. I really regret the late divorce, she said, the words echoing her newfound resolve. I'm going to start a new life. Much more secure than when I lived with you. The satisfaction of hearing her own defiant words surprised even herself. It was a small victory, a single crack in the wall of her father's control. She ended the call before he could respond, her heart pounding in her chest. Fear mingled with a heady sense of liberation. She was alone, adrift in a sea of uncertainty, yet for the first time, she felt a sense of ownership over her own destiny. The apartment, once a symbol of her isolation, now felt like a refuge, a space where she could finally breathe, finally be herself. The days that followed were a blur of unpacking, settling in, and navigating the unfamiliar landscape of her new life. She found solace in the simple routines of grocery shopping, cooking, and exploring the neighborhood. She discovered a small cafe down the street, its aroma of freshly brewed coffee a comforting constant. She started taking walks in the nearby park, watching the children play, their laughter a stark contrast to the silence she had grown accustomed to. Each small act, each ordinary moment, was a brick in the foundation of her new life, a life she was building with her own hands. The thought of Lu Yenming was a constant presence, a comforting warmth in the midst of the uncertainty. She hadn't seen him since the divorce, a deliberate choice to allow herself time to process the tumultuous events of the past few weeks. She knew she would have to tell him about the baby, about her father's machinations, about the complicated web of secrets that bound them together. The thought was daunting, yet she knew, deep down, that he was the only one she could truly trust. One evening, while preparing a simple dinner, a knock on the door startled her. Her heart pounded in her chest, a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. She peered through the peephole, her breath catching in her throat. It was Lu Yenming. He stood there, his shoulders slumped with fatigue, a shadow of concern etched on his face. Seeing him there, on her doorstep, a wave of emotion washed over her, a complex mixture of relief, longing, and fear. She opened the door, the words catching in her throat. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers, a silent question hanging in the air. And in that moment, Li Zhen knew that her life, once a carefully constructed narrative dictated by others, was about to take another unexpected turn. The opulent silence of her father's study was a familiar weight, pressing down on Li Zhen like the expectations that had shaped her life. Sunlight filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, indifferent to the tension coiling in the room. The rich mahogany desk, a testament to generations of Li family wealth, stood between her and her father, a physical barrier mirroring the chasm that had always existed between them. Li Yinan sat back in his leather chair, his gaze sharp and calculating, a predator assessing its prey. Li Zhen's fingers tightened around the strap of her purse, the leather cool against her skin, a small comfort in the face of the approaching storm. She could smell the faint scent of sandalwood, her father's preferred incense, a fragrance that always seemed to carry the undercurrent of unspoken demands. He's going to make this difficult, she thought, a bitter taste rising in her throat. She knew this meeting wasn't about familial concern, it was about control. Li Yinan cleared his throat, the sound echoing in the stillness. You've made quite a mess of things, Zhen. His voice was smooth, devoid of any warmth. Each word felt like a calculated strike, chipping away at the fragile composure she was trying to maintain. Li Zhen's breath hitched. She wanted to retort, to remind him of the years of emotional neglect, of the suffocating expectations, of the carefully constructed cage he'd built around her life. But she swallowed the words. This isn't about the past, she reminded herself. This is about the future. My future. I'm here to discuss a solution, she said, her voice steady despite the tremor of anxiety that ran through her. He steepled his fingers, his eyes fixed on her. A solution? Your impulsive actions have tarnished the Li family name. Divorce is a scandal. The familiar wave of resentment threatened to overwhelm her. Scandal? He's worried about scandal when he's never shown an ounce of genuine care. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to remain calm. My marriage was a sham, father. Everyone knew it. A flicker of annoyance crossed his face. Regardless, you're a Li. You represent this family. And now, you're carrying a child out of wedlock. He paused, his gaze hardening. Whose child is it, Zhen? The question hung in the air, thick with unspoken accusations. Li Zhen's hand instinctively went to her stomach, a protective gesture. She hesitated, weighing the consequences of her answer. Revealing the truth about Lu Yenming would complicate things exponentially. Not yet, she decided. I need leverage. That information is irrelevant, she said, her voice cool and detached. It's mine, she added silently, her hand tightening over the curve of her belly. Li Yinan's eyes narrowed. Irrelevant? This child will carry the Li name. I have a right to know. And you will, she countered, her gaze locking with his. But not today. Today, we're discussing my future, and the future of my child. He leaned forward, the sandalwood scent intensifying. Give me 1.2% of Li's shares, Li Zhen stated, her voice unwavering. She knew the number was audacious, but she also knew her worth. She knew the value she brought to the family, the sacrifices she had made. She was tired of being a pawn in his game. She wanted control. Li Yinan's eyebrows rose in surprise. 1.2%. You dare to demand such a significant portion? I'm not demanding, father. I'm negotiating. I want you to give birth to a grandson for the Li family within a year. The words hung in the air, sharp and precise. This was her condition, her price for securing her future and the future of her child. Inside, her heart pounded against her ribs. This is it, she thought. Everything rests on this. A long silence stretched between them, broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Li Yinan studied her, his expression unreadable. Li Zhen held his gaze, refusing to flinch. She knew he was calculating, weighing the pros and cons, the cost of her compliance versus the potential scandal of her defiance. The silence seemed to stretch on forever, each tick of the clock amplifying the tension. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and measured. 1%. And you sign a legally binding agreement ensuring the child carries the Li name and is raised within the family. Li Zhen's mind raced. 1% was less than she wanted, but it was still a substantial sum. Enough to secure her independence, enough to protect her child. It's enough, she told herself, the relief washing over her in a dizzying wave. 1.2%, she repeated, her voice firm. And I'll agree to the rest. He hesitated, a flicker of something that might have been respect crossing his features. Very well, he conceded, a hint of grudging admiration in his tone. 1.2%. But if you fail to produce a grandson within a year, he let the threat hang in the air. I won't, Li Zhen said, meeting his gaze. She knew the stakes. She knew the pressure. But she also knew she would do whatever it took to protect her child. As the details of the contract were finalized, a strange sense of calm settled over her. This was a victory, a hard-won battle in a war that was far from over. She had secured her freedom, at least for now. But as she left her father's study, the weight of the future pressed down on her, heavier than ever before. The contract was signed, the deal was made. But the real game had just begun. The fluorescent lights of the Civil Affairs Bureau hummed, a dull counterpoint to the frantic rhythm of Li Zhen's heart. Each breath felt thin, insufficient. Yesterday, the same sterile air had choked her with the finality of her divorce from Yusheng. Today, it pressed down with a different weight, the weight of secrets and a future she hadn't dared to imagine. The clerk's voice, echoing the same impersonal questions from just a day ago, seemed to mock her. "Didn't you get divorced yesterday? Why do you still call each other ma'am?" Li Zhen could feel the heat rising in her cheeks. The clerk's casual observation felt like a spotlight, exposing the raw, chaotic mess of her life. Yusheng stood beside her, rigid and unyielding as a granite statue. He hadn't spoken a word since they arrived, his silence a suffocating blanket. He must be thinking I'm insane, she thought, her stomach twisting with anxiety. First the divorce, now this. She glanced at the man on her other side. Lu Yanming. His presence, usually a source of comfort, felt alien in this sterile government office. His hand rested lightly on her arm, a silent reassurance. But even his touch couldn't quell the tremor that ran through her. The memory of last night's conversation with her father echoed in her mind. His voice, cold and calculating, had cut through the fragile peace she had tried to construct after the divorce. The contract, the family lineage, the grandchild he demanded, it all hung over her like a guillotine. The image of her father, sitting impassively in his study, the faint scent of sandalwood clinging to the air, made her shudder. She had felt like a pawn in his game, her life a mere transaction. And now, I'm trapped. The thought clawed at her, sharp and painful. The following weeks blurred into a surreal montage of whispered phone calls, furtive meetings, and the constant, gnawing anxiety that threatened to consume her. The pregnancy, a secret shared only with Lu Yanming, became a physical manifestation of her predicament. Each morning's sickness pang was a reminder of the choices she had made, the lies she had told, and the uncertain future that stretched before her. One evening, as rain lashed against the windows of her apartment, the phone rang. It was Xiaoyu, Yusheng's assistant. Her voice, usually crisp and professional, was laced with an odd hesitancy. "Mr. Yu, he's at the Red Sea Group headquarters. He's causing a scene." Li Zhen's heart sank. What now? She thought, a wave of exhaustion washing over her. She could almost hear Yusheng's voice, laced with anger and accusation, echoing through the familiar hallways of the company they had built together. The memory of his face, contorted with betrayal during their last argument, flashed before her eyes. She found him in his former office, the room still bearing the faint scent of his cologne. Papers were scattered across the floor, a testament to his rage. He stood by the window, his back to her, a silhouette against the backdrop of the storm-ravaged city. "What are you doing here?" Li Zhen asked, her voice trembling slightly. He turned, his eyes burning with an intensity that made her flinch. "Why, Li Zhen?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. "Why?" The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken accusations. The confrontation that followed was a brutal dissection of their failed marriage. Every resentment, every unspoken grievance, spilled out in a torrent of bitter words. He accused her of betrayal, of deceit, of shattering the life they had built together. She, in turn, lashed out at his controlling nature, his suffocating expectations. "We're done, Yusheng," she finally said, her voice hoarse. "It's over." Days later, another unexpected blow. Li Zhen saw Yusheng again, this time at the Civil Affairs Bureau. But he wasn't alone. A young woman clung to his arm, her eyes sparkling with a triumphant possessiveness that made Li Zhen's stomach churn. He moved on. Just like that. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. A strange mix of relief and a sharp, unexpected pang of something akin to loss washed over her. That evening, Lu Yenming found her sitting on a park bench, the city lights blurring through her tears. He sat beside her, his silence more comforting than any words could have been. "We'll settle this matter in private," he said finally, his voice soft but firm. "Or you can do whatever you want. Marry me." His words, so simple yet so profound, pierced through the fog of her despair. She looked at him, truly looked at him, for the first time since the whirlwind of events had begun. And in that moment, she saw not just the man who had saved her life 7 years ago, but the man who was offering her a future, a refuge, a chance at happiness. Their wedding was a small, quiet affair, a stark contrast to the lavish ceremony she had shared with Yu Sheng. Standing beside Lu Yenming, exchanging vows in a sun-drenched garden, Li Zhen felt a sense of peace she hadn't realized she craved. The weight on her chest seemed to lift, replaced by a fragile hope. As they walked out, hand in hand, she glanced back at the empty church. A single tear rolled down her cheek, a bittersweet farewell to the past, and a tentative embrace of the unknown future. The days that followed were filled with a strange, fragile tranquility. Yu Sheng, after a final, heart-wrenching phone call where he relinquished all claims, disappeared from her life. The Red Sea Group, once a symbol of their shared ambition, now belonged solely to Lu Yenming. Li Zhen focused on her health, on the life growing within her, on building a new life with the man who had patiently, silently loved her for 7 years. The past, with its tangled web of lies and betrayals, began to recede, replaced by the promise of a new beginning. The muted hum of the air conditioning unit was the only sound in Lu Yenming's office, a sleek, modern space overlooking the sprawling metropolis. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, reflecting off the polished ebony desk and casting long shadows across the room. Li Zhen sat stiffly in one of the plush leather chairs, the silence between them a heavy, suffocating blanket. Her gaze was fixed on the cityscape below, a dizzying tapestry of steel and glass, each building a testament to ambition and power, mirroring the complex web she found herself trapped in. Her stomach churned, a knot of anxiety tightening with each passing second. She could feel Lu Yenming's gaze on her, a palpable weight in the air, and it took all her strength not to fidget. He hadn't spoken a word since she'd entered, the silence amplifying her unease. He knows, she thought, her heart hammering against her ribs. He knows about the baby. Lu Yenming watched her, his expression unreadable. The morning light caught the sharp angles of his face, highlighting the weariness etched around his eyes. The events of the past few days had taken their toll, leaving him feeling drained, yet strangely resolute. He knew he had to address the situation, to confront the tangled mess of their past and present, but the words seemed to catch in his throat. Her vulnerability, so starkly displayed in her rigid posture and averted gaze, tugged at something deep within him. He'd spent years carefully constructing a facade of indifference, a shield to protect his heart, and yet, one look at her, and the carefully constructed walls threatened to crumble. He took a deep breath, steeling himself. "Li Zhen," he began, his voice low and steady, each syllable measured. She flinched at the sound of his voice, her body tensing further. Slowly, she turned to face him, her eyes wide and filled with a mixture of apprehension and defiance. The air crackled between them, thick with unspoken words and unresolved emotions. He looked different today, she realized, the usual sharpness in his eyes softened by a vulnerability she'd never seen before. "Is it because of me? Because Ophis?" The thought sent a shiver down her spine. "What happened last night?" she started, her voice barely above a whisper, then stopped, the words dissolving into the silence. How could she explain? How could she justify her actions, her desperate attempt to cling to a life that was already slipping away. "What happened last night was really a misunderstanding," she blurted out, the words tumbling from her lips before she could stop them. Even as she spoke, she knew they sounded hollow, unconvincing. "A misunderstanding?" She scoffed inwardly. "Sleeping with your ex-husband on the eve of your wedding is hardly a misunderstanding." "It was really a misunderstanding," she repeated, her voice laced with a desperation that even she could hear. She clasped her hands tightly in her lap, her knuckles turning white. Lu Yenming's jaw tightened. He'd heard enough. "What is done is not a misunderstanding, Li Zhen," he said, his voice hardening. The silence returned, heavier now, laced with the bitter tang of truth. The unspoken words hung in the air between them, Yusheng. The baby. Our marriage. Each one a landmine waiting to be detonated. He rose from his chair and walked over to the window, his back to her. The sprawling city below seemed to mock him, its relentless energy a stark contrast to the suffocating stillness in the room. He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath, trying to regain his composure. He had to stay calm. He had to think clearly. He couldn't let his emotions cloud his judgment. Not now. Not when so much was at stake. Li Zhen watched him, her heart sinking. His words, sharp and precise, had cut through her carefully constructed defenses, leaving her exposed and vulnerable. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them back, refusing to let them fall. She wouldn't cry. Not in front of him. Not now. She had to be strong. For herself. For her child. The thought of the child, growing inside her, a tiny, secret link between her and Lu Yenming, sent a wave of conflicting emotions crashing over her. Fear, uncertainty, and hope. A flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, they could salvage something from the wreckage of their lives. He turned back to face her, his expression softened, a flicker of something akin to understanding in his eyes. He saw the unshed tears, the barely contained fear, and the flicker of hope that mirrored his own. He walked back to his desk and sat down, the leather creaking beneath his weight. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on the polished surface, his gaze locking with hers. He knew what he had to do. He'd known it for a long time. "Marry me," he said, the words quiet but firm, echoing in the stillness of the room. Li Zhen stared at him, her breath catching in her throat. Marry him? The words reverberated through her mind, a lifeline thrown into the turbulent waters of her life. She'd expected anger, accusations, recriminations. She hadn't expected this. This quiet offer of commitment, of acceptance. Her mind raced, trying to process the implications, the sheer audacity of his proposal. He knows about Yusheng. He knows about the baby. And yet, he's asking me to marry him. Why? She whispered, the word barely audible. Why would he offer her this? Why would he choose to stay, when he had every reason to leave? He reached across the desk and took her hand in his touch surprisingly gentle. Because I love you, Li Zhen, he said, his voice low and husky, the words carrying the weight of 7 years of unspoken emotions. I've loved you for a long time. The confession hung in the air between them, fragile yet powerful, shattering the remaining fragments of their carefully constructed facades. Li Zhen looked at him, her heart aching with a mixture of relief and disbelief. She'd known, deep down, that his feelings for her were more than just a fleeting attraction, but hearing him say the words aloud, admitting the depth of his emotions, was both terrifying and exhilarating. She squeezed his hand, her own trembling slightly. She started, then stopped, the words failing her. How could she express the tumultuous emotions swirling within her? The fear, the hope, the love that had been buried beneath layers of denial and self-preservation. He didn't press her, his gaze holding hers, steady and reassuring. He knew she needed time, time to process, time to accept the truth of their situation, the tangled web of their past and the uncertain promise of their future. The silence returned, but this time, it wasn't heavy or suffocating. It was a comfortable silence, filled with unspoken understanding and a shared sense of purpose. The city outside continued its relentless hum, a backdrop to their private world, a world that was slowly, painstakingly, being rebuilt, brick by fragile brick. And in that moment, amidst the wreckage of their past, a flicker of hope ignited, a fragile promise of a future they could build together. The ornate clock in the hall chimed, a mocking reminder of the ticking time bomb within Li Zhen. She sat stiffly on the brocade sofa, the silk clinging uncomfortably to her skin. Sunlight streamed through the high windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, each one a tiny, swirling reflection of the chaos in her life. Her father, Li Yinan, paced before the fireplace, his back ramrod straight, the very picture of controlled fury. He hadn't spoken a word since she arrived, the silence heavier than any shouted reprimand. Li Zhen clutched her purse tighter, her knuckles white. He knows, she thought, the realization a cold knot in her stomach. He knows about the divorce. The silence finally shattered. Explain yourself. Li Yinan's voice was low, dangerously calm. Each word was clipped, precise, like the snap of a bone. Li Zhen swallowed, the lump in her throat making it difficult to speak. There's nothing to explain. Lie, a small voice whispered in the back of her mind. He sees right through you. She could feel her father's gaze boring into her, dissecting her, stripping away her carefully constructed composure. He stopped pacing and turned to face her, his expression unreadable. Nothing to explain. The Yu family called. They want to know why their daughter-in-law is gallivanting around the city without their precious son. His lip curled in a sneer. Divorce? You dare bring such shame upon this family? The knot in Li Zhen's stomach tightened. Shame. The word echoed in her ears, a constant refrain throughout her life. She took a deep breath, a sudden surge of defiance coursing through her veins. Grandpa, I know Yusheng is the eldest son of the Jade family. But me and him, it's really inappropriate. The words tasted bitter on her tongue, but they were out, hanging in the air between them, irrevocable. Li Yinan's eyebrows shot up, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. He clearly hadn't expected such open defiance. Inappropriate? You were married for 3 years. What changed? He advanced towards her, his shadow falling over her like a shroud. 3 years of misery, Li Zhen retorted, her voice trembling slightly. 3 years of pretending. 3 years of suffocating under the weight of expectations, of playing the dutiful wife while her heart withered and died. The memory of Yusheng's cold indifference, his constant criticisms, his blatant infidelity, fueled her anger. This isn't about your happiness, Li Zhen, Li Yinan hissed, his voice dripping with contempt. This is about the family. About the contract. About the heir. He slammed his fist on a nearby table, the force of the blow rattling the delicate porcelain figurines displayed there. The mention of the contract sent a wave of nausea through Li Zhen. The ironclad agreement that bound her life to the Yu family, that dictated her every move. The contract that ensured the continuation of the Li family line through a grandson bearing the Yu name. A bitter laugh escaped her lips. Heir. What heir? Li Yinan's eyes narrowed. Don't play coy with me. I know you're seeing someone else. That Lu Yenming. He spat the name out like a curse. Li Zhen's heart pounded in her chest. How much did he know? Had he discovered the truth about her pregnancy? She met his gaze, a flicker of fear in her eyes, but also a newfound resolve. Yes, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm with Lu Yenming. And I'm carrying his child. The silence that followed was deafening. The only sound was the frantic beating of Li Zhen's heart. Li Yinan stared at her, his face a mask of disbelief. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again, as if struggling to find the words. The carefully constructed facade of control he maintained so meticulously was crumbling, brick by brick. He finally spoke, his voice hoarse. "You're pregnant?" Li Zhen nodded, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. She had expected rage, accusations, perhaps even violence. But what she saw in her father's eyes was something far more unsettling. Fear. "This changes everything," he muttered, sinking into a chair, his shoulders slumped in defeat. The weight of the unspoken, the implications of her revelation, hung heavy in the air. He looked older, frilier, the iron grip he held on his family's destiny suddenly loosened. The contract, the lineage, the carefully orchestrated future he had planned for her all shattered. Li Zhen watched him, a strange mix of pity and triumph swirling within her. For the first time in her life, she felt a sense of liberation, a freedom she hadn't dared to dream of. The fear that had held her captive for so long had finally dissipated, replaced by a quiet strength. She had broken free. Later, after the initial shock had worn off, Li Yinan began to bargain, to plead, to offer concessions. But Li Zhen remained firm. She had made her choice. She would not be controlled, not by her father, not by the Yu family, not by anyone. She would build her own life, her own future, for herself and her child. News, like wildfire, spread through the intricate network of Red Sea Group. Whispers and speculations filled the hallways, weaving a tapestry of intrigue and gossip. Xiaoyu, Yuxing's ever-loyal assistant, relayed the fragmented information to his distraught boss, each piece adding fuel to the fire of Yuxing's wounded pride. He paced his office, a caged tiger, his anger a tangible force. He had lost her, lost everything. Across the city, in the sleek, modern office of Lu Yanming, the atmosphere was markedly different. Xiao Lu, his assistant, stood before him, relaying the same news, but the reaction was one of quiet satisfaction. A faint smile played on Lu Yanming's lips. He had waited 7 years, 7 long years of silent devotion, and finally, she was his. He would protect her, cherish her, and give their child the life she deserved. The game had changed. The players had shifted. And Li Zhen, once a pawn in her father's game, was finally in control of her own destiny. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the city, marking the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The rhythmic slap of waves against the hull was a relentless percussion against Li Zhen's frayed nerves. The gentle rocking of the boat, far from soothing, only amplified the nausea churning in her stomach. The salty tang of the sea air, usually invigorating, now felt oppressive, clinging to her like the suffocating weight of Yuxing's presence. He paced the small cabin, a caged tiger, his energy radiating outward in palpable waves of anger and frustration. Her grandfather, frail and bewildered, sat huddled in a corner, his eyes darting nervously between her and Yuxing. This wasn't a reconciliation, it was a prison. Li Zhen closed her eyes, the image of Lu Yanming's face a fleeting comfort against the harsh reality of her confinement. His quiet strength, his unwavering gaze, felt impossibly distant. Had he even realized she was gone? Would he come looking for her? The thought sparked a flicker of hope, quickly extinguished by the cold dread that gripped her. Yuxing stopped pacing and loomed over her. His shadow fell across her face, a physical manifestation of the darkness that seemed to be consuming him. Li Zhen, he began, his voice strained, each word laced with a bitterness that twisted her insides. We need to talk. She didn't open her eyes. What was there to talk about? The chasm that had opened between them was too wide, too deep, to be bridged by words. He wants to rewrite the past, to pretend the last few days never happened, she thought, the irony a bitter taste in her mouth. But some things, once broken, can never be truly mended. Li Zhen, he repeated, his voice softer now, tinged with a desperation she hadn't expected. I know I messed up. I know I hurt you. But we can fix this. She finally opened her eyes, meeting his gaze. The raw pain reflected there mirrored her own, but beneath it, she saw something else, a flicker of possessiveness, a refusal to accept that their story was over. No, Yu Sheng, she said, her voice quiet but firm. We can't. He flinched as if struck. Why not? We were happy, weren't we? A humorless laugh escaped her lips. Happy? Their life together had been a gilded cage, built on expectations and obligations, not love. Were we, Yu Sheng? She countered, the question hanging heavy in the air. She saw the doubt flicker in his eyes, a crack in the carefully constructed facade he presented to the world. He knows the truth, even if he doesn't want to admit it. The rocking of the boat intensified, the waves growing choppier. The storm brewing outside mirrored the tempest raging within her. Yu Sheng turned away, resuming his restless pacing. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the creaking of the boat and the rhythmic crash of waves. Finally, he stopped again, his back to her. You made me a dresser when I was in college, he said, his voice barely a whisper. The non sequitur startled her. It was a memory from their early days, a time when their relationship had still held the promise of something real. He's grasping at straws, she realized, clinging to fragments of a past that no longer exists. I don't like it here, he continued, his voice thick with emotion. You make me another one. Li Zhen's heart ached. He wasn't talking about a dresser, he was talking about their life together, the familiar comfort he craved. He wanted her to rebuild the world they had lost, a world she no longer wanted. Yu Sheng, she began, her voice laced with a weariness that seeped into her bones. I can't. That world is gone. He spun around, his eyes blazing. Why? Because of him. Because of Lu Yanming. The name hung in the air, charged with unspoken accusations. He sees Lu Yanming as the obstacle, the reason for our failure. But the truth was far more complex, a tangled web of unspoken resentments and unmet expectations that had been festering for years. It's not about him, she said, forcing herself to meet his gaze. It's about us. We were wrong for each other, Yu Sheng. We always were. The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy with finality. He stared at her, his face a mask of disbelief, then slowly, agonizingly, the fight seemed to drain out of him. He sank into a chair, his shoulders slumped, the image of defeated pride. The silence stretched, broken only by the relentless rhythm of the waves. The boat pitched violently, throwing them both off balance. Li Zhen gripped the edge of the table, the nausea rising in her throat again. Days blurred into nights. The confinement, the constant tension, the relentless rocking of the boat, it was a slow torture, chipping away at her resolve. Yu Sheng's anger had given way to a quiet resignation, a chilling acceptance of the inevitable. He would sit for hours, staring out at the endless expanse of water, his face etched with a profound sadness that mirrored her own. He's mourning the loss of our shared dream, she thought, a dream I never truly shared. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Yu Sheng spoke, his voice barely audible above the gentle lapping of the waves. I love you, Li Zhen. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken regret. Li Zhen's heart twisted in her chest. She knew he meant it, in his own way. But his love was a cage, a suffocating embrace that had stifled her for far too long. I know, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. And that's the tragedy of it all. She loved him too, once, in a different time, a different life. But that love had withered under the weight of their unspoken resentments, their unfulfilled desires. The next morning, the boat docked. Standing on solid ground, breathing in the fresh air, Li Jun felt a wave of relief wash over her. Yu Xing stood beside her, his face pale and drawn. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a profound sadness. "Take care of yourself, Li Jun," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Then, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the bustling crowd. Li Jun watched him go, a strange mix of relief and sorrow churning within her. It's over, she thought, the realization hitting her with the force of a physical blow. Their chapter was closed, finally, irrevocably. She turned, her gaze searching the crowd, a flicker of hope igniting within her. And there, standing across the street, his figure tall and imposing against the backdrop of the city, was Lu Yenming. He was watching her, his eyes filled with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. He hadn't abandoned her. He had come for her. And in that moment, as she walked towards him, she knew she was finally free. Sunlight, sharp and unforgiving, sliced through the sheer curtains, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air of Li Yinan's opulent study. The scent of aged leather and sandalwood hung heavy, a familiar backdrop to the brewing storm. Li Jun sat rigidly on the plush sofa, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, the smooth leather cold against her skin. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs, each beat a painful echo of the turmoil within. She could feel her father's gaze, sharp and assessing, boring into her. He hadn't spoken a word since Yu Xing's dramatic exit, but the silence was more oppressive than any shouting match. Li Yinan finally broke the silence, his voice smooth as polished jade, yet edged with steel. "So, the prodigal son returns with his tail between his legs." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken accusations. Li Jun's stomach clenched. She knew what was coming, the inevitable interrogation, the dissection of her life choices laid bare under his merciless scrutiny. She lifted her chin, a flicker of defiance sparking in her eyes. "He didn't return, father. He left." Semantics, Jinjin. The result is the same. The Li family name is dragged through the mud. He sighed, a theatrical display of weariness. Li Jun bit back a retort. Dragged through the mud. As if his machinations and manipulations were somehow pristine. Her silence was a fragile shield, barely deflecting the weight of his disapproval. She had expected this, anticipated the cold fury that would emanate from him. But the exhaustion gnawing at her was a surprise. It was the weariness of a battle fought on too many fronts. The study door opened, and Lu Yenming entered, his presence a tangible shift in the atmosphere. The tension thickened, the air crackling with unspoken animosity. Li Jun's gaze flickered to him, a silent plea in her eyes. He met her gaze, his expression calm, reassuring. A silent promise passed between them. Li Yinan's eyes narrowed, assessing the silent exchange. "Lu Yenming," he acknowledged, his voice laced with a thinly veiled disdain. "You seem to have a knack for inserting yourself into our family affairs." "With all due respect, sir, Li Jun is my wife," Lu Yenming replied, his voice even, respectful, but firm. He moved to stand beside her, a subtle but powerful display of solidarity. Li Jun felt a wave of warmth wash over her, a small ember of hope flickering to life in the desolate landscape of her heart. "Wife?" Li Yinan scoffed. "A marriage of convenience. A charade to save face." He turned his gaze back to Li Jun, his eyes glinting with a dangerous light. "Don't think I don't know about the child, Jinjin. The contract still stands. A Li heir is expected." Li Jun's breath hitched. The contract. The constant, looming shadow over her life. A tool her father wielded to control her destiny. She felt Lu Yenming's hand gently cover hers, his touch grounding her in the swirling chaos. She squeezed his hand, drawing strength from his presence. "The contract is null and void, sir," Lu Yenming stated, his voice calm but unwavering. "Li Zhen is carrying my child. Our child." Li Yinan's face contorted in a mask of fury. He slammed his hand on the desk, the force of the blow rattling the objects on its surface. "You dare defy me?" he roared, his voice laced with venom. "I am not defying you, sir," Lu Yenming replied, his gaze steady. "I am protecting my family." The silence that followed was thick with tension, the air vibrating with unspoken threats. Li Zhen held her breath, bracing for the inevitable explosion. But it never came. Li Yinan's shoulders slumped, the fury slowly draining from his face, replaced by a chilling calculation. "Very well," he said finally, his voice low and dangerous. "You win this round, Lu Yenming. But don't think for a second that I will forget this. The Li family always gets what it wants." He turned to Li Zhen, his gaze softening slightly. "Junjun," he said, his voice weary. "You have made your choice. I hope you won't regret it." He paused, his eyes flickering with a hint of something that might have been regret, or perhaps just resignation. "You and Xiaolu's wedding, you can rest assured. Li Yinan will not threaten you with grandpa again." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Li Zhen's heart ached. This wasn't the victory she had envisioned. It wasn't a reconciliation, not a forgiveness. It was a truce, a fragile peace brokered on a battlefield of broken trust and shattered expectations. She nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Li Yinan left the room, the heavy door closing behind him with a finality that resonated deep within Li Zhen's soul. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the soft hum of the air conditioning. Lu Yenming turned to her, his eyes searching hers. He cupped her face in his hands, his touch gentle, reassuring. "Li Zhen," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "I love you all my life." He leaned in, his lips brushing against hers, a feather-light touch that sent shivers down her spine. Li Zhen closed her eyes, leaning into his touch, the warmth of his love a balm to her wounded heart. In his embrace, she found a strength she hadn't known she possessed. The future stretched before her, uncertain, daunting, but no longer a lonely path. She had made her choice, a choice born not of obligation or fear, but of love and hope. And in that moment, surrounded by the remnants of a shattered past, she felt a flicker of something akin to peace. The fight was far from over. But for the first time in a long time, she felt ready to face it, not alone, but hand in hand with the man who had saved her, not once, but twice.